Now, I know already what you're saying out there. Really, Ed? You're doing the Lancaster, one of the most famous combat aircraft to ever fly. You're really doing the Lancaster as a forgotten aircraft? Sellout. Well, yes. I am hoping that the use of the name Lancaster will garner me those sweet, sweet views that all us YouTubers would do a deal with the devil for. But actually, this particular model of Lancaster, the B6, is so obscure that I'd actually never heard of it until it was brought to my attention by John Dell of the Dinger Aviation website. Long-term viewers of the channel will know I get most of my best leads from him, and I would have to say that this is one of them. The Lancaster is, quite rightly, legendary, essentially the mainstay of RAF Bomber Command from 1942 until 1945, and it was constructed in understandably huge numbers, with more than 7,300 built. But in amongst that large number, just 10 were B6s. This model originated from an Air Ministry specification, B14/43, that wanted a bomber aircraft that could operate at 35,000 feet and had superior range to the Lancaster and other heavy bombers in service, principally with an eye to future deployment to the Asian theatres and the war against Japan. Avro entered two options, the Lancasters B4 and B5. These would eventually be adopted, though renamed as the Lincoln 1 and 2. Check out my video on that aircraft if you are interested in that story. But as the proposed aircraft were a fairly extensive redesign of the Lancaster, a fact that led to it ultimately being classed as a new aircraft entirely, it was thought that a more straightforward improvement of the existing Lancaster by putting more powerful engines on would be worth exploring. Thus we come to the Avro Lancaster B6. The first two aircraft allocated were DV-170 and DV-199, which were newly built Lancaster B3s and were supplied to Rolls-Royce for conversion. This principally entailed switching out the two aircraft's Packard-built Merlin 28s for Rolls-Royce Merlin 85s. For a reference, especially for American viewers, the Packard Merlin 28 was the same fitted in the Curtiss P40F. The new engines were installed in a concept that Rolls-Royce was working on, the Universal Power Plant, or UPP for short. The idea, which is similar to the so-called power egg, was that on multi-engine aircraft, instead of the power plants being integral to the design, they instead could be essentially modular, that could be added or removed as a complete unit. In terms of the different engines, on paper the difference might seem minor, as the 28s generated just over 1,500 horsepower in combat operation, while the 85s produced around 1,700. Okay, the increase in power would no doubt be welcomed, but was a marginal increase in an aircraft as big as a Lanc. But here we get the trap that is easy to fall into if we just judge things by numbers in books, because the Merlin 85 had a 2-speed, 2-staged supercharger. This, in essence, was very similar to the engine that the Spitfire Mark 9 or the P-51D Mustang were fitted with, and it meant it produced much more power at much greater altitudes. This was soon demonstrated in testing of the new aircraft. The standard Lancaster B1 being built in 1944 and equipped with 4 Merlin 24s was found in testing to have a top speed of 280 miles per hour at 10,000 feet, a cruising speed of 200 miles per hour, and a service ceiling of 21,400 feet. The B6 in comparison had a top speed of 313 miles per hour at 18,300 feet, while it could cruise at 279 miles per hour at 23,900 feet. Essentially, the B6 could cruise at basically the then current Lancaster's top speed at an altitude that the earlier aircraft couldn't even reach. That's quite an impressive jump. Indeed, though combat operations were generally conducted by the B6 at around 23,000 feet, there are stories of some crews flying missions at 30,000 feet. The limitation seems to have been not the engines or aircraft, but rather whether the tail gunner would freeze to death. Certainly the B6 engendered some interest, though as said, only 10 were ultimately converted. And of these, only 4 would be used operationally, when in 1944 a few of these were supplied to the Pathfinder Force. This was an elite series of squadrons whose job it was to guide the main bomber streams into the targets and mark them to help ensure bombing accuracy. To go along with their specialist role, the service aircraft had their front and dorsal turrets faired over and were fitted with cutting-edge electronics for the time, including radar jammers and loads of chaff. codenamed Window by the British, so as to confuse German defences. With this, they conducted operations generally over the heavily defended Ruhr Valley area of Germany throughout 1944, often in daylight. But despite their much improved performance, which saw them generally employed for diversionary roles or as command aircraft for raids, the B-6s proved to be problematic. On the ground, the powerful engines had a nasty tendency to suddenly surge or hunt, and the pilots had to keep the revs high while taxiing to prevent oil buildup on the spark plugs, which didn't do the aircraft's brakes a lot of good. Additionally, the improved performance meant that the B-6s had problems staying slow enough to stay with the main formations, which were made up of the slower earlier model Lancasters. They also were reputedly a pig on the amount of servicing they required, which didn't endear them to their ground crews. All said, the B-6s were a bit awkward, especially in the very limited numbers that they were used in, and so they only saw a few months of active service before being withdrawn in November 1944, with one of their numbers lost in action. So it might seem that the aircraft was a failure, but in fact they provided one service quite handsomely, because the issues the Lancaster B6 would experience both in testing and in combat all paid off when the Avro Lincoln entered service in August 1945. This used the same Merlin 85 in a UPP configuration as the Lancaster B6, and as a result many of the issues that had been ironed out by the time the Lincoln reached squadrons because of the experience and experimentation done with the Lancaster B6. Plus, withdrawal from combat also didn't mark the end of the B6's service. Several carried on being used as engine testbeds, including ND784, who got to become one of the most peculiar looking of all the Lancs when she was modified with different experimental turboprops in her nose for testing. And that is the story of the Lancaster B6, which must be one of the least known aircraft coming from one of the best known, if that makes sense. Cheers to John again for his help with this. Check out his website if you like odd aircraft stuff. I'll link to it in the description. Have a good one, and I'll catch you all again next time.